I'm Lori Damrosch. I'm the president of the ASIL, and we are extremely grateful for the sponsorship of this event. The Dutch Embassy, for a number of years now, has been extremely helpful to us in bringing to us guests who come all the way to Washington from The Hague, and we've had a long series of very successful collaborations, I think going back 6, 8, 10 years. We're grateful also to the president of the Hague Institute for Global Justice, as also quite instrumental in bringing this event together. So with acknowledgement to those who are co-sponsoring this program with us, I would like to turn the microphone over to Abiodun Williams, who is the president of the Hague Institute for Global Justice, and he will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Laurie. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to what I'm sure will be one of the highlights of this year's ASIL meeting, a discussion with Ambassador Ahmet Üzümcü, Director General of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. This plenary session is part of the regular Hague segment at the annual meeting, and it is a privilege for the organization which I lead, the Hague Institute for Global Justice, to be involved along with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the City of The Hague in bringing the work of the Hague-based institutions to this esteemed audience. And I'd like to acknowledge the Deputy Mayor of The Hague, who is here in the front row. The Hague, as you all know, more than most, is the epicenter of international law. Behind this reputation is his role as the host city to a unique constellation of courts and tribunals. But that is not the only role the city plays on the world stage. That we have the privilege of welcoming the Director General here this evening should remind us, I think, that The Hague is not just a legal capital, but rather it is where the pursuit of peace and justice come together. Nothing could have illustrated the OPCW's contributions to this mission more fittingly than the decision of the Nobel Committee to award the organization the 2013 Nobel Peace Prize. Having labored under the radar for years in pursuit of the implementation of the 18-year-old Chemical Weapons Convention, the Nobel Prize was a very public recognition of what the OPCW has achieved, most recently, though notwithstanding setbacks, in Syria. The aim of today's session is to engage in a wide-ranging discussion with the leader of the OPCW, Ambassador Üzümcü. I will start proceedings by posing questions to the Director General about the work of the organization, particularly in the context of its mission in Syria. I will then open the conversation to the audience for what I'm sure will be a lively exchange on the legal and political challenges that the OPCW confronts. We're incredibly fortunate to welcome Ambassador Üzümcü, who has led the OPCW since being appointed Director General by states parties in December 2009. Immediately prior to this appointment, he served as Turkey's ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, the latest of a series of high-level positions within the Turkish Foreign Service. His diplomatic career includes postings to NATO, the Conference on Disarmament, which he chaired in 2008, and Israel, where he served as ambassador. Director General, we are grateful to you for taking the time to be with us in Washington today. I know that current events in Syria make it difficult to accept many such invitations, so it is a particular privilege to welcome you to ASIL. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Üzümcü. So, Director General, the Chemical Weapons Convention has been with us for 18 years now. How do you account for the CWC's success as a multilateral instrument? Why has it succeeded when other instruments have been less successful, or at least less contested?
First of all, let me express my gratitude for this opportunity to address such a distinguished audience. Indeed, does it work? Okay, now it does. So let me express my gratitude for this opportunity to speak at the annual meeting of ASIL. And I want to, in fact, welcome all of you, distinguished members of the society. I want to also express my gratitude to those who organized this event, and as well as the other events that I was able to attend. Thank you very much for this. In response to your question, what really made different the CWC from other processes, why it has been successful? I think the answer could be short. It much depends, in fact, in such endeavors, multilateral endeavors, on the political will of member countries. And in the OPSW, while the convention was negotiated, in fact, in the 1980s and in 1990s, the political will has prevailed, and the international community, in fact, was able to develop such an important legal instrument, which took about 20 years, by the way. I mean, it wasn't an easy process. There have been, of course, give and takes, and in the end, they reached a compromise. The compromise may reflect in certain instances the lowest common denominators and may not always work in practice because of, again, compromises. But in our case, it worked. So we have not a long convention, but the annexes are very comprehensive and very much detailed, especially the verification regime. I think the verification regime, in fact, made it different than many other processes. For instance, Biological Weapons Convention, which is earlier than the Chemical Weapons Convention, doesn't have such a verification regime. And it's unique in this regard. Secondly, this is a treaty which doesn't make any discrimination. There are no haves or have-nots. I mean, every state party has the same rights and obligations. And there's a global ban on chemical weapons. If they had some stocks, they have to be destroyed under the verification of the organization. And it's being done. So the level of destruction now is 87% of all stockpiles which are declared to the organization. Two major possessor states, the United States and the Russian Federation, have reached quite significant levels. In the case of US, is 90%. So there's still 10% which needs to be destroyed in Pueblo and Kentucky. And in the case of Russian Federation, it's 86%. So the progress in destruction, which has been the main focus of our convention regime, CWC regime for the past 18 years, has been significant. And I think it's moving steadily, and we expect within the next 7-8 years that all stockpiles will be destroyed. And there are other issues like universality, of course, but on this too, the fact that there are 190 states parties right now, this is the second largest organization, international organization. So that's also impressive in my view. One other perhaps element which made a difference than others is the historical background of all this process. It took about 100 years, in fact, to come to that stage. The convention entered into force in 1997, and the first attempt, in fact, to prohibit the use of gas and poison was in 1899 in The Hague. And as we all know, it failed. And another attempt was in Geneva, the Geneva Protocol, which also failed. Because it didn't prohibit the production, but only the use. And there were some other uses which we have seen, especially during the Iran-Iraq War. So all this, I believe, makes it quite different. And success, of course, I think the credit should go first to those who drafted and negotiated and drafted the convention, such an important text. And then the state parties, which in fact fulfilled their obligations over the years, with some delays in certain cases. For instance, the destruction should have been over by the end of April 2012, which didn't happen. The Russian Federation and US could not meet this deadline. But state parties, taking into account the complexities of those operations, agreed to extend this deadline. And there could have been some other problems which we encountered in implementation of the convention. There are still several state parties which were not able to develop their national legislation based on the convention, which is a key element, of course, for implementation. And the number is quite high, over 70 out of 190. So that's at the moment our main focus of one of the main focus of our activities, in fact. And we are encouraging all those countries. We are assisting them. We are inviting them to The Hague to develop their legislation. Why it didn't happen? In many cases, for small countries which had limited resources, this has not been a priority. They think that they don't have chemical weapons. They don't have chemical industrial plants which are declarable. Therefore, what's the point of having a national legislation based on the convention? So that's it is not, of course, our approach. We think that in order to make the convention truly universal, we need the implementation of the convention by all state parties. It is important, even if they don't have such activities, they have to be sure, or we have to be sure that they are able to enforce the convention if there are some activities prohibited by the convention, and without any legislation they can't do it. So if there are transits of dual-use chemical material, which shouldn't be, exported or imported through their country, so they should be able to stop them. Or there could be some activities which are prohibited on their territory. So that's there's still much to be done. But in spite of all this, I think given the significant progress in destruction, given the performance of the organization in Syria and so on, this process, the CWC regime, has been seen as a very successful disarmament process. And in fact, we shouldn't be perhaps self-congratulatory, but as I said, not only the secretariat that I am leading, but the political will, the determination of state parties have played a key role in all these achievements. The results were quite tangible, and I think they were recognized too. Thank you.
You've mentioned the importance of political will and, of course, the legal aspects of the CWC. As a treaty implementing organization, the OPCW sits at an interesting juncture between the political and the legal. How is this played out in relation to your mission more generally and the mission to eliminate Syrian chemical weapons more specifically?
The legal, in fact, instrument that we have is one, and this is our Bible. And when we look for some activities, practices, and if we have questions, of course, we always look at the Convention. And in certain cases, we have had, in fact, for instance, on the deadline issue, looking at the Convention, everything should have been destroyed, as I said, by 2012. Was there a room for extension? Legally speaking, no, there wasn't a room for extension. But there have been some consultations for which lasted about 2 years among state parties, and they looked for different options. Amending the Convention was not really a suitable or realistic option, and they looked for a political solution. And in the end, there was an agreement among all state parties, and they agreed that with increased transparency measures to be, in fact, met by possessor states, and regular reporting to the organization, to other state parties, and so on, and in fact explaining the reasons for delays, if there were further delays. So all this led to a decision by the conference, and it worked. There have been some other cases also, like the, for instance, the elimination of the Syrian chemical weapons program. Normally, according to the Convention, all chemical weapons have to be destroyed where they are located. I mean, where they are, on the territory of the possessor state. Given the situation in Syria, this wasn't possible, and everyone recognized that it wouldn't be possible. Therefore, there was a decision to remove them outside of Syria and destroy them outside of the country. And clearly, the Convention could not be interpreted. It couldn't be that flexible to be interpreted this way. What happened is the UN Security Council, in fact, took a decision based on the agreement reached among member states, and it did endorse that given this very special, extraordinary situation in this country, the chemical weapons could be destroyed outside of the country. So that shows also that because of political reasons, the legal challenges or obstacles, in fact, could be overcome. That's something that we should welcome. I don't think this shows the weakness of any legal document. In case of multilateral work, if really it's within the object and purpose of the Convention, if not in the letter, if it is within the spirit, and if there is a collective view among those states which are parties, I would suggest that the law is also, in fact, to interpret the legal instruments in such a flexible way. So that could be other examples, over the past 18 years. But I think those two examples are quite striking to me, and they happened during my time. And this interface between the political and legal aspects is, of course, very important.
Director General, there have been reports of use of chemical weapons by ISIS in Iraq, as well as new allegations of use of chlorine gas as a weapon in Syria. How serious is the threat of chemical terrorism, and what can be done to address it, and what is the role of law in these cases?
The threat of chemical terrorism, I believe, is real. And now the likelihood of use of chemical weapons by states is gradually becoming less and less remote, I should say. And but whereas the risks or threat of the use of chemical weapons by non-state actors, by terrorists, by criminals is increasing. There have been reports of attempts of acquiring chemical substances which could be used in the production of chemical weapons by different groups. And there have been, in fact, one particular incident which happened in Japan in 1994-95. There were three separate attacks, but most important was, in fact, in the subway in Tokyo, which killed 13 people and injured several hundred. And the cult, Shinrikyo, as you will remember, used sarin. So they were able to produce a nerve agent. And the delivery, the use was quite primitive. Otherwise, the damage could be much, higher and considerable. The technology is not that sophisticated. The access to those chemicals is also possible. The most challenging part is the delivery of those chemicals. So I believe that, first of all, the states parties, also for this reason, should be able to develop their legislation and enforce it in their own countries. And looking at this, also this perspective, that's extremely important that national measures are in place. And the threat emanating from one country could affect other countries in the immediate region or elsewhere. We know that terrorism doesn't recognize boundaries, and this applies also to chemical terrorism. So, for instance, chemical weapons which might be produced in one country might be transferred to another and used there. So that's a major concern to all of us. In the organization, we have an open-ended working group on terrorism, which was established after 9/11. And it's used as a platform for exchange of views and a possibility of also sharing best practices. I think the OPCW can do more in this respect. For instance, recently the Secretariat has submitted a paper prepared by our legal office on the accountability of non-state actors in the use of chemical weapons, because there was a confusion. There is no mention of non-state actors or terrorists in the convention, and some observers thought that they wouldn't be held accountable. Of course, it doesn't make sense, but how to do it? So a penal codes of all states parties based on the convention, they should include such provisions for prosecution and punishment of those who use their nationals who use chemical weapons. But in many states parties still don't have it. And also the problem may occur for extraterritorial coverage or not. If there is no extraterritorial coverage in certain national legislation, this poses also some problems. And finally, if the attacks occurred on territories which are not controlled by certain states, for instance, in the case of Syria now, the government is not able to control certain parts of the country, and if the activities took place there, then who would pursue them, and if the perpetrators were identified, and how they should be punished, and so on. In this respect, there were some discussion points which we submitted to states parties consideration, and discussion will continue. International Criminal Court was also mentioned as an option, or any ad hoc international courts could be envisaged if necessary. But still, there are different aspects, legal aspects with regard to chemical terrorism. And we are also working on another paper that with regard to prevention measures. Prevention is very important. This requires collective efforts among states parties, close cooperation, and in fact also cooperation between relevant international organizations. As the OPCW, we have taken some initiatives to strengthen this cooperation with some UN agencies. There have been some workshops, so we are developing some mechanisms which were not in place. But unfortunately, this threat and concerns will be are likely to be with us in the coming years. Thank you.
Given your success, can the CWC and the work of OPCW and its states parties serve as a model for disarmament efforts further afield? And what role can and does international law play in future disarmament efforts?
There have been some observers, in fact, who suggested that the CWC experience, especially the CWC verification regime, could be a model, for instance, for a possible nuclear disarmament process. And if, for instance, the Biological Weapons Convention had a verification regime, I'm sure there would be a lot of similarity in terms of activities, verification activities. This doesn't mean that everything could be, applied. Clearly, there will be some specific aspects for every disarmament process. But in general, looking at the success of this convention too, in terms of implementation, I understood that there could be really important lessons to be drawn from our experience. And also, perhaps looking at the lessons learned, some aspects also could be perhaps improved. So in general, I believe that the CWC may be a model, and in fact, may be also a source of inspiration. So if we were successful in chemical weapons convention and disarmament, why shouldn't we do it in other areas? So that's why I believe it constitutes a good model of effective multilateralism. I know that, generally speaking, in every country there are skeptics about multilateralism, but clearly we can, in fact, confidently say that it works. In certain instances it works, and this relates to me back to a political will, but if there's a will, of course, there's always a way.
Well, on multilateralism, many countries, I often think, are skeptical of it because it has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. So that's also one of, I think, the reasons for the skepticism. But more seriously, Director General, as you know, the theme of this year's ASIL meeting is adapting to a rapidly changing world. What lessons can be learned from the OPCW's experience, including through the Syria Mission, for those of us working in international law, on how best to adapt to rapid changes?
I actually pointed out some flexibilities, in terms of interpretation or implementation of the convention. But the challenges, of course, are quite considerable as to the future. There are scientific, technological developments. The overall security environment is changing, and as all other institutions and processes do, I think the OPCW, of course, will have to adapt itself. We have the necessary mechanisms in place. We have, for instance, a scientific advisory board, which is composed of 25 eminent scientists coming from different parts of the world, and they are looking at scientific developments. And those which are relevant to us are identified and reported, and if necessary, there are some recommendations as to measures to be taken it's been submitted to me through me to the state parties. So we are cognizant of the rapid evolution of science and technology, and this is very important. But more precisely on the security environment, and I think I mentioned the chemical terrorism, and we have to look at also our verification regime, whether there was room for adaptation and how to make it more effective to counter the new security risks or threats. So that's a challenge. When I arrived 5 years ago, there was a big question mark as to the future of this organization, whether it should be in place, it should continue to carry out its activities after the elimination of stockpiles of chemical weapons. I think this question is now removed from the minds of our member countries, and they think, in fact, that this organization should carry on its activities, especially in relation to non-proliferation, so to prevent access to chemicals, to prevent the re-emergence of chemical weapons. So we are, in reality, we are in a transition phase within the OPCW, as many other associations, groups, institutions do. We are adapting ourselves. I don't expect any change in our legal instrument, the Convention, any amendment, but I believe that it provides us with the necessary flexibility to deal with the new environment.
Well, I'm sure the audience would like to engage with the Director General, so I think this is an appropriate juncture to open it up to your questions. I see there are 2 stationary microphones, so perhaps if you could just stand at the microphone closest to you. If you have a question, identify yourself and perhaps your institutional affiliation to give the DG some context. And I'll take the questions in sets of 3s, perhaps. And I know lawyers are never bashful about posing questions. Oh, okay.
My name is Steven van Hoogstraten. I am from The Hague, so I'm a guest here as well. But there's one question I would like to ask, because it seems a sort of wonder story, this organization of chemical weapons prohibition. And I just wonder if there was a development of new chemical weapons somewhere in the world in a state that would not take the interest of others so close to its heart. How would the OPCW know about that? Can you say that your success is a blanket success? Or are you always concerned about here and there's, where, well, regimes are preparing things that you simply do not know about? Thank you.
I think looking at the current, first of all, let me say that the OPCW, that means Secretariat, doesn't have the means, in fact, independent means of collecting information. We don't have satellites, we don't have intelligence reports, but state parties have. And it would be very difficult to hide and make it undetectable the production of chemical weapons through an active program. So that's practically impossible. So this gives us sufficient assurances. But there could always be attempts of producing small scale, I mean small amounts of toxic chemicals or chemical weapons. That's another matter, which we should bear in mind. This is the first point. And secondly, the incentive of producing chemical weapons by any state has diminished now because it lost its value, military value. It's become less meaningful than in the past because of protection measures. There are very sophisticated protective equipment and detection equipment, so measures can be taken very easily. Therefore, for many years now, the chemical weapons are seen rather weapons of terror and panic rather than anything of military value. But in very shortly, I think we can be assured and that such activities would be detected easily and necessary measures could be taken. Our goal is clearly to, immediate goal is to ensure the full universality of the convention. That's important. And I'll wait whether this question will be raised. If not, I'll cover it. Yeah.
Mark Wojcik, I'm a professor at the John Marshall Law School, and I'm going to ask a very easy question because someone behind me will ask a very difficult question, I'm sure. Congratulations on winning the Nobel Prize. What has changed in your organization internally and in your effectiveness since winning this award?
Shall we take other questions?
Thank you. Hans Corell, former legal counsel of the United Nations. When I was following the news on the Syria issue, of course there was a Swede involved also in the process, I read the annexes to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and I found a very interesting connection here with the Security Council. Maybe you could explain that, because normally you would have a body established by the convention, and that is the body that you are heading. But then if there was states that are not parties to the convention, then there is a way of involving the Security Council in a manner that you could also conduct inspections and also destruction of chemical weapons through that process. I just sort of faintly remember this, but it would be very interesting to hear you explain how this works and why this was introduced. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Let me start with the Nobel Peace Prize. Actually, internally, this has redoubled the enthusiasm of our staff. And it happened, in fact, at the very beginning of the Syria mission. And we knew that it was very challenging. We looked for volunteers among our inspectors, and we were pleased to see that there were 60 of them who were ready to go. We didn't need that much. We sent 15 of them, then they rotated, of course, but even those who came back were ready to go again to Syria. I think the Nobel Peace Prize played a role in this. So I believe that recognition, you know, such international recognition is always useful. And externally, this organization was poorly known, and it enhanced really the profile of the organization. And I think this is helping us in terms of implementation. Now more states parties, in fact, are showing interest in developing legislations, in developing their internal mechanisms of coordination. They have to have national authorities in every country which would be in charge of coordinating the implementation domestically. They are doing it now. So that we are receiving more visitors in our organization. All senior officials coming to The Hague for other purposes come and visit us. And that's good. That's good because the fact that the achievements of you know, such a multilateral organization is recognized, then this gives also encouragement to others who work in separate fields, but again for peace and security. So clearly the Nobel Committee, in fact, whom I met in December 2013, told me that this was the result of careful consideration among 270 nominees, And we didn't know, by the way, that we were a nominee until the night before. And this came as a very pleasant surprise. My colleague who is sitting there informed me that after a call he received from Oslo, and I said, are you sure that no one is teasing with us? He said, no, it was real. So that's how this happened, but I think this is very important for any organization, I'm sure. But it helped us in the OPSW. As to the relationship with the UN in general, I know that there are some lawyers from the UN among the audience, and we have a relationship agreement, in fact, with the UN. We are not within the UN system, but we have cooperation based on a document. And also, there are a few references. One reference is to the UN Secretary General mechanism. This is for the investigation of alleged uses which may happen in states which are not yet party to the convention, or on territories which may not be controlled by the states parties. It happened in 2013, as you will remember. The Secretary General called me in March 2013, and he asked whether we would be ready to support a UN investigation, a UN-led investigation in Syria. I said yes, we were preparing for such a contingency. We thought that as long as those weapons existed in this country, there was always a risk for use. But it took some time. Then the Secretary General appointed one Swedish scientist who led this team. And out of 12 members of the team, 9 of them were from OPSW, 3 from the WHO. And they did a very good job, in fact, in Syria, while determining the use of sarin in Ghouta, in the outskirts of Damascus. So that's one reference to a UN mechanism. There is another reference to UN Security Council. In case of serious non-compliance cases, we have, in fact, the task or the requirement to report to the Security Council and the UN General Assembly. So this requires, of course, an internal procedure within the organization, but we have such an obligation. So, yeah. And the Security Council, of course, would take the necessary measures.
Thank you. Thomas Burri, I'm a professor at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. As you might be aware, people are gathering in Geneva, if I may mention that city here, the competitor, if you like. They're gathering in Geneva and talk about whether a ban should be adopted on autonomous weapon systems, lethal autonomous weapon systems. Given your success, I was wondering whether you have any good advice for the people gathering there. Thank you.
I'm Jeff Price from Steptoe & Johnson, and I wanted to ask if you could give more detail about your practical experience in Syria, some of the actual challenges you faced. I remember when the agreement was announced following John Kerry's ultimatum, there was a view that this was an incredibly positive agreement, but it would be extremely optimistic to meet the deadlines for destruction of chemical weapons under any circumstances, and particularly in an area where there was not only a civil war, but certain areas were not under the control of the government. So there's a challenge in security, and there's also a technical challenge to implement new technologies for the destruction of these chemical weapons. And I wonder if you could give us more detail on how practically you went about accomplishing this mission in the time frame that was given to you.
May I start with the second question? In fact, the whole Syria mission was a big challenge. The timelines were very tight, short. In many countries, in fact, which possess chemical weapons of such an amount, over 1,000 tons, it took years to destroy them. Whereas in the case of Syria, we were expected to take them outside of the country within a very short time and complete everything in less than a year. But of course, the state parties' engagement, their support, determination, and making available all necessary resources did play a crucial role. For instance, we established a Syria Trust Fund, and over 30 countries, 30 state parties, did contribute to this fund. So the money was available. We contracted several companies for disposal of chemicals to be transferred outside of the country through a tender process. This did help us. We actually shortened the procedures as much as possible. The United States came up with the idea of destroying some chemicals at sea for the first time on a ship. So 2 neutralization facilities were installed on a large cargo military ship, and it was sent to the Mediterranean. And it sailed while destroying. Actually, the forecast was, the estimate was for 60 days, but it was done within 45 days. And of course, with the presence of our inspectors on board. Another challenge was, in fact, the environmental concerns. Many NGOs, in fact, did raise such concerns. And we had to explain to them that there wouldn't be any release into the water. And we explained, we took them to Cape Ray, the ships, and there were some visits by their representatives. And we tried to be as transparent as possible and inform the public about the progress. The security, clearly the security situation was a major problem. The transportation from the sites, different sites actually, was done by the Syrians to Latakia, where they were boarded onto 2 ships provided by Denmark and Norway, escorted by military naval vessels provided by China, Russia, and the UK. So that was really a major undertaking, and with the participation, active participation and support of several state parties. During this transportation, the security measures was taken by the Syrians, but for our inspectors to verify them, of course, sometimes it was not possible to deploy them to certain sites. So we used GPS-mounted video cameras, video recorders, and they were used by the Syrian officials and later checked by our experts to verify that everything was done properly. There was an obligation also to have at least a random sampling and analysis, and it was done at the port. So once they were brought to the port, our inspectors did take samples and analyze them on the ground in a mobile lab to confirm that the chemicals were exactly those which were declared. Still work is ongoing. There are production facilities which are being destroyed, 12 of them. 5 of them are underground. 4 of those underground, in fact, are actually destroyed. Destruction is being done by filling these underground facilities and also putting 2.5 meters thick concrete plugs. So they are totally rendered unusable, and also some cameras and monitoring equipment will be installed in order to make sure that there won't be any attempt of access to those facilities. There is also an issue of declaration with regard to Syria. We want to make sure that the Syrians have declared everything they had to declare, and there have been consultations for the past year we have a team dealing with this and going to Syria, interviewing the officers who are involved, scientists who are involved in the chemical weapons program, and preparing reports for concentration of states parties. The aim is to make the declaration full and also to build confidence between Syria and the rest of our members. Clearly, this is a unique experience for us. It has never happened in the past, and it's unique that in the midst of conflict, that so much weapons have been removed and destroyed. As to the first question, I should apologize, but as I said earlier, it's very hard to give advices to others, who are running certain initiatives. I served in Geneva. I was at the conference, ambassador at the conference on disarmament. I had some experience there with regard to other initiatives. What my experience is that in the past years, decades, in fact, the civil society has become very active in many areas, initiatives, including arms control and disarmament. I think, for instance, for anti-personnel landmines, for ATT, arms control, arms trade and treaty, small and medium-sized, weapons, and so on. I think in the future too, we should expect that the civil society continue to play a significant role. In our case, I think we were able to give a more prominent role to NGOs than in the past. For instance, they were not able to speak at our annual conferences. Now they do. And there is a coalition which is supportive of our OPCW, the organization. And I think this interaction with civil society will continue. Thank you.
More questions? Well, I'm already. I think, actually, all right, our time is up. Well,
just one more point that I want to do on universality. As I said, there are 6 countries which are not members. Egypt, Israel, Myanmar, Angola, South Sudan, and North Korea. So we are working for them to join the convention as soon as possible. And the states parties are doing the same. Myanmar has already passed the legislation through the parliament. We expect them to be 191st state party soon. Angola and South Sudan, it's going to be a matter of time. The most challenging will be North Korea. As to Egypt and Israel, the situation has changed considerably in the Middle East after Syria has become a member. And we expect those 2 countries to reconsider their position. In fact, linking this issue to others, the other issue, including the security situation in the Middle East. And we hope that we will make progress very soon. Thank you.
Well, just thank the Director General for his candid and illuminating responses to the questions, and would also like to thank you, the audience, for being with us this evening.
And I'd like to extend thanks also both to our valued guest, the Director General, and to our excellent moderator, and also again to the Embassy of the Netherlands for sponsoring this event. We're deeply grateful. And